Carrie Sheffield is a columnist and broadcaster in Washington, D.C. She earned a master's in public policy from Harvard University. Today, she serves as senior policy analyst at the Independent Women's Forum, and she's author of the newly released book, Motorhome Prophecies, A Journey of Healing and Forgiveness. Carrie, we are so excited that you are joining us. Thank you for being here.
Virginia, thanks so much for having me. I love your show.
Well, we are so excited to talk about your brand new book, Motorhome Prophecies, A Journey of Healing and Forgiveness. This is your story. It's your story of growing up in what you describe as a dysfunctional, abusive home and your journey into then higher education, Washington, D.C., the policy space. I want to begin by talking a little bit about your childhood. Do you do you recall what your earliest memory was as a little girl?
Yeah, so here's the book if folks want to grab it, Motorhome Prophecies, A Journey, Healing, and Forgiveness. Um, One of my earliest memories, and I describe it in the book, is my family was being interviewed by child custody services to potentially
Mm.
take the kids away. And at that point, there were 6 of us. Later on, there were 8 of us, the kids. Um, And I remember hiding under the couch because I didn't want the bad guys to take me away. But
Mm.
they found me and they took me and my siblings over to the child custody services. This was in Massachusetts. And we had been brainwashed and just conditioned by our dad to say how great he was. And so I don't know their process, but somehow they let us back home. And then we hightailed it out of there and left and went to Utah, and we were not taken away. So I find it interesting that as an adult now, thinking about when you have a parent who puts such a big responsibility on your kids to uphold them, when it's supposed to be a parent's job to support the children and lift them up. It was a role reversal in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it sounds like exactly what it was. You were number 5 in the lineup in your family among the kids, right?
I was, yeah, of the people who became adults. I did have 2 older siblings who passed away as infants, but yeah,
Okay.
8
Wow.
kids. Mhm.
Okay. And describe a little bit of what the dynamic was like between the kids and your mom and dad on a daily basis at home.
Well, the book's called Motorhome Prophecies because all 10 of us spent large chunks for the kids growing up living in a motorhome. And I describe the existence as careening between a third world and a first world existence quite frequently.
Hmm.
So sometimes we did have houses and we were living in like a regular house, but then we would be back living in the motorhome. And then sometimes we'd be living in a tent. So my mom gave birth to my brother when the family was living in a tent. When I took my ACT exam to go to college, we were living in a shed with no running water. It
Mm.
would be piped in from one of those green hoses. So it was really unstable. I would say that's probably the strongest or the most consistent word was
Yeah.
inconsistency. And the reason we live this way is because my dad claimed that he was a prophet. He was excommunicated from the official Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which used to be called the Mormon Church. They've asked to not use that phrase, but his philosophy and kind of theology is part of the broader kind of Mormon diaspora. There are lots of different offshoot groups, and my dad just kind of became a self-styled, homegrown Mormon prophet, self-proclaimed.
So then you all were moving around so much. I think you referenced in the book that you went to 17 different schools and homeschooled. So were you all moving so that in his mind he could preach to various people, or what was that dynamic?
Yeah, so he had, and he's 86 and has Alzheimer's, so he's not really active, but he had world class musical gifting. So he was hand selected by a guy named Andres Segovia, who was one of the world's greatest classical guitarists. And Andres Segovia was knighted by the King of Spain, had an asteroid named after him, had 10 honorary doctorates, had a Lifetime Grammy Achievement Award. So just this phenomenal musician. He had selected my dad to be one of his proteges on classical
Mm.
guitar, both for performance and musical composition. And my dad has a master's degree in music composition and was a professor of guitar at Brigham Young. So incredible world class talent. He also won a nationwide composer contest for the up and coming, musical composer. And so you combine that level of gifting with his childhood sexual abuse. And that's a theme of the book, is kind of this intergenerational trauma. Unfortunately, he had been sexually molested by a Mormon babysitter, an LDS babysitter
Mm.
from his LDS congregation. And she was never held accountable. He never received treatment. And he said later on that that made him feel suicidal. And so you combine that, childhood trauma with this intense gifting, with his interpretation of the LDS theology, and you get this homegrown, um, basically person who claims that he'll be president someday. And in order to fulfill the call in his life, he needs to go and play his beautiful guitar music, while passing out brochures and trying to convert people to be LDS. And so, like you said, part of what he said was, he needed to reach as many people as possible. And it was always the Holy Ghost telling him what to do, is what he claimed.
Okay. So then what was your view of religion growing up when that was your world that you were living in the context?
Yes, I mean, so when you're a kid, you tend to believe your parents, and your dad's your hero. So for a long time, he was. And I thought we were incredibly special, that out of the planet of billions of people, that my dad was chosen to be president someday. And eventually, all 10 of us, he assigned all the kids instruments, and my mom as well. And so all 10 of us would play with him on the street corners, playing classical music and passing out brochures and trying to get people to convert them to be LDS. And so it just eventually, with time, I came to see this dichotomy between the way he would behave in public versus the way he would treat us at home. And
Mm.
I began to see this discrepancy, and to see the anger and the violence and the outbursts. He would also sometimes get in street fights and had been thrown into jail for getting in street fights. So it was this pattern of physical violence and emotional abuse and spiritual abuse. And so eventually I just, you know, all the kids were treated this way. And eventually, two of my brothers developed schizophrenia. The oldest one developed it, and he tried to rape me when I was 17, and he
Mm.
groped me. And it became a really existential moment at that time, to say, wow, like I'm not safe here. And I need to
Yeah.
figure out if I actually believe this. And that's when I went on kind of I call it my first investigative journalism project, is my father a prophet?
Mm. And what did you discover?
Well, I found some of his handwritten prophecies, basically, or handwritten revelations that he'd written down, that he claimed were from God, and he'd written them in Elizabethan English and in the way that the King James Bible was. And that made my hands start to shake, because I said, wow, my father here is writing down things the way that Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism, would write down things in the Doctrine and Covenants, which is one of their books of scripture. And I said, wow, my dad is basically trying to make himself like Joseph Smith. And because I was devoutly still practicing LDS, I saw a conflicting loyalty between my father, who was trying to claim a mantle that was not authoritative, and the official LDS church, because the official LDS church only has one prophet at a time, and he lives in Salt Lake City, and his name was not my dad's name. And so I knew that he was a false prophet under that authority structure. And so I made a choice that I would leave home. And I told my dad that I wanted to go away to college. And he raised his right hand to the square, and like he was making an oath. And he said, I prophesy in the name of Jesus that you'll be raped and murdered if you leave.
Mm.
So at that moment, it was a crossroads. Do I stay and face physical violence potentially from my brother again? Or do I leave and have the potential of this prophecy coming true? I decided to take my chances and left home. And my dad said my blood changed, and I was no longer his daughter, and I was not allowed home all through college. And I chose to use that as fuel to just to excel in my work and in my career.
Where did you go when you left home? Do you remember that first night?
Yeah, so I left early in the morning, around 4 in the morning. My best friend, so it was my 17th public school at that point. She had become a friend that senior year. She came and picked me up, and we went to her parents' house. I was deathly afraid that something terrible was going to happen to me. I made us pray together there in her car, this little Volkswagen Cabriolet convertible,
Mm.
and you know eventually, after a week, actually, I came back because I was so afraid. And they've done studies about abused women. And, I was a daughter. It's different for a romantic partner. And so it takes a romantic partner about 7 times before they finally leave somebody permanently. And for me, I ended up just leaving twice, and I left the second time and didn't come back. But, um, it can be the conditioning that you receive that you can't survive on your own. It's very real. And then also just the fear. But I was able to get enough support the second time, and was able to go to college through, a combination of working at Taco Bell and then later at student newspaper jobs and scholarships, and cobbled together enough to make it.
And what was your view of God at this time when you'd left home? You were in college at Brigham Young University for your undergraduate.
Yeah, so I first went to a state college in Missouri for a year,
Mm.
Union State, and then I transferred to Brigham Young. I went to the state college. I say in the book, for the simple reason that they did not have an application fee, and Brigham Young
Mm.
did, and I had no money. And actually, the New York Times and also the Georgetown student newspaper, they've written about this, that they say that this is an impediment to low income people to their application fees. And in my case, it was true. I was also a little bit scared because the BYU system requires a bishop's endorsement. And so I was afraid my hometown bishop would potentially have told my dad that I was applying. So that was another reason as well. But in any case, I transferred my sophomore year. But, um, you know, during that time, I was very devoutly LDS. But it was once I got to BYU, I went under a big, I call it my second big investigative journalism project. Do I believe the fundamental tenets of the LDS Church? And that's when I started to dig more into kind of the founder, Joseph Smith, and more about his background that I had not been told in Sunday school. And for me, I found it to be disconcerting, and a thing that I could no longer believe in. And to me, it was devastating because it was my identity. I did not want to not believe it. And I say in the book, I still have a lot of family members and friends who are still LDS. And so I have a lot of respect for the amazing humanitarian work they do. I know at Heritage and other places, think tanks, they show how amazing the social mobility is in Utah and the strong social capital. So I think there are some amazing characteristics of Mormon culture that I even still try to carry with me today. But theologically, I couldn't believe it anymore. And so I left, and then after graduating, I, left Mormonism, and I arrived in DC, and I started to go to some Christian churches, and I actually had a really terrible experience.
Mm.
And I went to a church where one of the young men in the young adult group tried to force me to have sex with him, and I just felt like,
Mm.
while I was a little bit tipsy, and I just was like, well, I thought as a Christian you're supposed to be different. Like, what are you doing? Like this, it was really upsetting. And then I was also in a women's Bible study, and they ended up kicking a woman out of the Bible study whose mother was dying of cancer because this woman had gotten in an argument with the Bible study group leader because she was under a lot of stress and emotional angst because she had taken family medical leave to care for her mother, and the Bible study leader had flown to go visit her. And that's when they got in the argument. And
Mm.
Bible study leader comes back and says, I don't want to do this unilaterally, but can we take a vote about whether we keep her in the study or not? And she'd been in this group for years at this point, and they voted her out. I voted to keep her in, but I was overruled with a couple other people. And at that point, I just felt disgusted. And I was like, religion is mumbo jumbo, sociological construct. If there is a God, he hates me. I hate him too. I don't know if he exists or not. I was not atheist. I called myself agnostic, which is, I call it like a fence sitter. You're not making a claim there is a God or that there is not. You just kind of shrug your shoulders.
So then I know in there you landed in DC. When you arrived in DC, had you already gotten your master's at Harvard, or did you land in DC and then go on to go to Harvard?
Yeah, I was in DC for 3 years, and then I went to
Okay.
Harvard and
Okay.
did the master's there.
Okay. So then at what point did you start to think, maybe I'm open to giving this religious thing, this God thing, another try?
Yeah, so I like to say I became Christian because I had tried everything else, or I had tried a lot of other things that weren't fulfilling that void, that God shaped hole in our hearts. So I ended up being agnostic for about 12 years. And during that time, there's a great book by Tim Keller titled Counterfeit Gods. If you don't know who Tim Keller was, people called him a modern day C.S. Lewis. He was a longtime pastor in New York City in the Presbyterian denomination. But his book, Counterfeit Gods, each chapter is basically like a counterfeit God that we as humans, we want to put ahead of God. And they're usually good things. That's why they're gifts. We worship the gift instead of the giver of the gifts.
Hmm.
And so things like marriage and family for women or sex for men, I mean, these are just typically um, work, money, power, status, things like that. So I kept trying all these things and they kept failing me. I tried putting career as my God, and then I got laid off. And it was because this new management came in and people from the old management, we had a target on our backs, and they're just a series of round of layoffs. And it was devastating to me because I felt like that was my entire self-worth, because I didn't have family. I didn't have God. It was my religion. And then to have my God reject me, I felt suicidal. And so
Wow.
then I moved on. Thankfully, I was able to pick myself up from that, move on to the next false idol, which was marriage and dating. I ended up dating abusive men and being stuck in abusive relationships, and realizing that was not going to fulfill my self-worth either. And then eventually I thought I had landed on something that would not disappoint me, and that was public service. And
Hmm.
I went to the Harvard Kennedy School, which is named after JFK. And I think in some ways I had put John F. Kennedy almost as like a messiah type figure. And in the same way that Martin Luther King Jr. and Abraham Lincoln, who was killed on Good Friday, they were sort of messiah type figures who gave themselves for their people. I had done this subconsciously, I think, with my politics and my public service. And it's more common on the left for this to happen, that the secular left, that their politics and policy become their religion. But for me, I was coming at it from the right. And so, um, but then for me, I got disrupted when Donald Trump happened. And I just felt like I cannot worship this guy. And I was a never Trumper in the 2016 election. And I felt like he hadn't proven himself as a conservative. There was no track record for him. He had donated to his Democrat opponent, Hillary Clinton, before. So I felt this existential crisis of meaning, that I can't have this guy be my end all be all. And so I like to say, and it sounds funny, but Donald Trump is one reason why I became Christian, is because
Wow.
it was more my aversion to the idea of having that be my ultimate source of meaning. And so it was that. And then in combination, after that happened in 2017, so I spent 2017 kind of studying. I also got my hands on, I was given a book by, co-authored by a PhD physicist from MIT. And it was a book about the interplay between science and faith, and how
Hmm.
they're perfectly in alignment, and how the probabilities of creation being random chance are so infinitesimally small. You have to take it almost infinite decimal points, point one, that it's happened just randomly. And then just learning more about metaphysics and subatomic particles and waves and particles, and how it really takes a lot of faith to be an atheist. And it takes a lot of faith to have science be your religion, because so much of our physics sits on a knife's edge and is so precarious. And so it's an incredible book that I read. The title is You Are the Universe. But so I like to say it was Donald Trump and science were the two main forces that led me to faith.
That's a very unique story. I don't think many people would say that, Carrie. It's powerful. And you talk a lot in the book about this journey of mental health as well, and navigating your past and working through those traumas and the abuse, and how that has also played a role in your relationship with God and in becoming an independent woman. You wrote in your piece for CNN, now a recovered agnostic, I have personally experienced faith's role in healing my mental health before embracing a healthier, balanced view of faith and religious practice. I visited hospitals 9 times for depression, fibromyalgia, suicidal ideation, and PTSD. Through all of that, what do you think kept you from totally giving up and just ending it?
Yeah. So, it was a combination of, I guess, pluck. um, a friend of mine read the book and said she's just thinking that there's a way forward. There's a way forward, and I think the belief that life is worth living. I think that definitely comes from a spiritual nature. And I have an op-ed this week that I wrote for Fox News, looking at really the dichotomy of what's happening in our country right now that's troubling is that we have the highest suicide rate since 1941, which is since
Mm,
the Great Depression. And we have the highest number of suicides ever. The most recent data we have is 2022. Almost 50,000 people committed suicide. And that's
mm,
nearly 17 times the number of people who died on 9/11. And that's just happening every year. And the depression rate is the highest that it's ever been. So something's happening to our mental health. And I do believe that's part of why I needed to write this book now, to come out of the shadows and talk about these struggles so that people can see what works, that what is quantitatively proven. And so in this op-ed that I wrote, I pointed to overwhelming scientific evidence that faith, religious practice, spiritual practice, religious community is good for your mental health. It is strongly associated with low suicide, strongly associated with lower depression, strongly associated with less substance abuse, which is less alcoholism, less opioid addiction, and not to say that if you're spiritual or Christian that you will never suffer mental health issues. That's a lie. But it's just that statistically, it is so much better to handle these issues while in a walk of faith. And this is scientifically proven. I quote studies from Harvard School of Public Health, the National Bureau of Economic Research, the Psychiatric Times. I mean, it's indisputable. And yet, on the flip side, you also have this overwhelming atheist industry. So the people who run therapy and the psychologists and psychiatrists, 61% say they're either atheist or agnostic. And so there's almost like this perfect collision. And Harvard School of Public Health said that there is evidence that patients who don't get spiritual health or their spiritual needs integrated into their treatment plans, that their health suffers. And so there's a mismatch. And I think that that's really important to talk about at this time in our society, that we have to look at the science. That's the phrase,
yeah.
trust the science. And yet, unfortunately, we see so often this, Abigail Schreier with her bad therapy book and Jonathan Haidt with his anxious generation book. These treatments are becoming worse than the actual. I mean, it's the actual symptoms can be exacerbated by bad therapy.
Why do you think there is that disconnect? Because if Harvard is putting out research saying, here is the data, people of faith tend to fare better on the mental health front uh, when faced with challenges of life. Why then isn't the psychology community embracing that and saying, oh, great, this is a powerful tool that we have to help people, to encourage them to find faith, to be in a church community or another faith community?
Well, it's interesting. The Harvard researcher who led that research, and is leading it, I don't want to throw him under the bus, but I'm just saying that the left has tried to cancel him, actually. And they've tried to come
Mm.
after him, and tried to say that he's a bigot. And so that's, I think, a common reason why faith is rejected, is because people say that, well, religious people are closed minded and abusive. And I think also the broader context of Judeo-Christian values being under attack, um, is because, and I talk about it in the book, religious people are flawed human beings, and so unfortunately, and I say this as a recovered agnostic, at the time when I was agnostic, I would see the sins of religious people and then want to reject the whole thing. And, I quoted from Frederick Douglass in the book, the abolitionist, and he said, between the Christianity of Christ and the Christianity of this land, I recognize the widest possible difference. So I
Mm.
think sometimes, and the experience that I had in those Christian churches right out of BYU is part of why I became agnostic, because I saw this terrible behavior of Christians. And so I think that that's part of it. There is this, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and so that's one of the main themes that I talk about in the book, is the difference between religion and God, and that at its best, religion brings people and connects them with God. At its worst, it becomes a stumbling block, and in my case, it can be abusive. And that was what was interesting in one of the literature reviews that I talk about in that Fox op-ed in the Psychiatric Times. They did find a few studies where religion was associated with negative mental health, but it was so small compared to the overwhelming positive. But in our media, what do we focus on? Of course, we focus on the
Mhm.
negative. And so every headline of abuse in the church gets disproportionate attention to the good that faith does.
Sure. What's your number one hope that people take away after reading the book?
My hope is that people can get a sense of knowing that God loves them, that there is a God, and to know the difference between God and religion, or religion and relationship, as I say. And also this idea of divine order, which is living an ordered life is putting God first, and then people,
Mm.
and then things. And a disordered life is the life that I had been living, which is putting people first, then things, and indifferent to God. And again, I'm far from perfect. I make mistakes. I fall out of that order quite a bit, but I still have that as my template of where I'm looking to live my life now. And I find that that is
Power.
a healthier place overall.
The book is Motorhome Prophecies, A Journey of Healing and Forgiveness by Carrie Sheffield. Carrie, how can we follow your work?
Thank you, Virginia. Yes. So folks can get the book wherever you get your books. Motorhome Prophecies. It's on Amazon. Would love 5-star reviews. That helps the algorithm. And then I've got a Substack, so feel free to sign up for that. And then my work at Independent Women's Forum at IWF.org.
Excellent. Carrie, thank you. Really, really appreciate your boldness, your willingness to share your story here with us today.
Thank you for having me.